Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second session of today's Economics Day. We have a Behavioural Economics team going for this session and a senior advisor from the Behavioural Insights team. You may also know them as the Nudge Unit. Mr. Chadeesingh focuses particularly on education, which is very topical now. He's been writing on the well-being of teachers, how to keep up attendance for students, and the integration of technology in classrooms. So I think we'll have a lot to talk about today. Thank you very much.
Super, thanks for that introduction. I will just pull up my slides and make sure you can all see them. So bear with for 1 second. Can you see these okay?
Yeah, nice, clear. Yeah.
Super, lovely stuff. So yeah, thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak today about Behavioural Insights. As was mentioned, my name's Lau, and I've been working at the Behavioural Insights team, or as we're sometimes known, the Nudge Unit, for the past 5 years. Before joining the team, I studied economics at university, and I worked in the government economics service as a civil servant. And then I also taught economics and politics before joining the team. So today I'm going to give you a quick kind of introduction to Behavioural Insights, what we're talking about when we say those words. And I'm also going to introduce our EAST framework, which is often our starting point for applying Behavioural Insights or thinking about how we respond to a particular challenge. And then we're going to have lots of time for questions. So I'm just going to talk for about half an hour or so, give you a bit of a feel for our work, and then do feel free to ask those questions. So to start with, what do we mean when we say Behavioural Insights? Really comprises 3 key components. So the first is that we take evidence about behaviour, evidence about how humans, you and I, actually behave when making decisions. We apply that to a range of different challenges. So across the team, we work on basically every area that you might imagine in terms of public policy. As was mentioned, I focus on schools projects, so you're going to hear a bit more about that today. And we then combine that with robust evaluation. So wherever possible, we use randomized control trials to evaluate our ideas as the gold standard method of evaluation. But before we kind of get into the theory, I'm just flashing up my first Slido question. So you can see here, exam results were worse than expected in 2002, 2004, and 2006. And that is particularly true for boys. And if you could respond on Slido with your thoughts as to why that might be the case. And I'm going to do it as well. Okay, just going to give another minute or so for this to come in. It's quite interesting. Okay, so some calls of boys are lazier, but in the center we seem to have football tournaments, and my favorite because it's coming home. So yes, this is about football. In 2002, 2004, and 2006, England qualified for either the World Cup or the European Championships. In 2008, Steve McLaren was manager. We did not qualify, and boys did not do much worse in their exams. So really what this shows, and a couple of academics looked into it, if there's a international football tournament going on in the summer, boys tend to do worse in their exams because they're disproportionately watching those football games, therefore not revising, and then doing worse in their exams. And the size of this effect is huge. It's basically the equivalent of going from having an amazing teacher to having an average one, in terms of what it could do to your grades, and also really significant impact on lifetime earnings from getting those lower grades. Certainly back at this time, England weren't very good. That decisions to watch those games and then potentially lose out on tens of thousands of pounds over your lifetime, probably not a rational decision, but these kinds of environmental effects on people's behavior can have a really significant impact. And that's what a lot of our work in education focuses on, is kind of the subtler, smaller things that maybe people aren't thinking about. All right, final little warm-up activity. And this is a little trickier because I can't see most of you, but just play along with me. Everybody put your hands up. I want you to put your hands down when you know the answer to the question that is flashed up. So hands down as soon as you know. What is 2 times 2? I'm guessing everyone came down pretty quickly, but hands up again. I've skipped on a little bit. Put your hands down when you know the answer to this question. So I'm guessing some of you might have gone down very quickly, might be maths geniuses, but for most of us, it'll take a bit of time to work through 24 times 17. So you should feel a bit of a difference between those two calculations. And what that helps to illustrate is this framework for thinking about behavior, which is called System 1 and System 2. And this was developed by this guy, Daniel Kahneman, who won a Nobel Prize for this work. And what he sets out is these two systems, System 1 and 2, and sometimes called fast and slow. So System 1, that's our fast system, and it's kind of intuitive and effortless. So when I ask you what's 2 times 2, and you immediately know that it's 4, you're using System 1. And if you think about your kind of regular journey into school, there are probably some days when you get into school and you think like, I can't really think about how I got here, because you kind of do it on autopilot because you've done it so many times. So you're probably using System 1 to do that kind of commute into school. System 2, on the other hand, is much slower and more deliberate. So it's the kind of thinking that you'll draw on, or that most of us will draw on, when needing to calculate something like 24 times 17. And when we get back to being able to go on more holidays again, when you're traveling in a foreign country, you really have to focus to get where you're going, or you're going to get lost. And so you're likely to be needing to use System 2. So on the face of it, System 2 seems pretty amazing, and System 1 feels like, okay, we just use that for the easy stuff. But the challenge is it's really exhausting to use System 2, so we can't do it all the time. So it's actually really useful that our brain is also able to draw on System 1. The challenge, though, is that when we're in a System 1 kind of way of thinking, we're quite prone to bias. System 2, when we're being much slower and more deliberate, much less prone to bias. And when people are designing government policies or communications, and they're sat in an office doing that, they're probably using their System 2 to think about those things. And when you're doing that, it's very easy to imagine that the recipient of a letter or some kind of communication is also going to be in a System 2 kind of space, but it's actually quite likely that they'll instead be using their System 1 thinking, which is much more prone to bias. And as you'll see with the examples that I talk through, that's when, by presenting things in slightly different ways, we can encourage people to take a desirable action. So that's a little bit of the theory, just a little bit on where I work. So Behavioural Insights team, sometimes called the Nudge Unit. We were set up kind of right at the heart of government, a small team within the Cabinet Office. And from there, we've now grown. We're now an independent social purpose organization with offices around the world. And the kind of work that we do kind of still goes back to our original mission, which is all around encouraging and supporting people to make better choices for themselves. And you'll hopefully see just a little bit of that in my presentation. So now I'm going to introduce our EASE framework for applying behavioral insights. And this is basically the main thing to take away from the presentation in terms of what we do. This is often our starting point. If we want to encourage a particular behavior, we should make it easy, should make it attractive, should make it social, and you should make it timely. And the reason that easy is in a different color is because if you can do anything at all, you should make it easy. So I'm now just going to talk through some examples of our work under each of these categories, starting with easy. So with easy, one of the things that we think about is the power of defaults, whatever the default option is, which is incredibly powerful. So I'm sure almost all of us have smartphones, right? This thing is infinitely customizable. You can set it up in an incredibly bespoke way, but most of us, myself included, will just go with like the factory default settings. Another powerful way to make it easy is just simplifying things. So if you ever got like a really long email, maybe from a teacher, maybe from a relative, and it's just like you've got to scroll through all this text. Those are the kind of emails that it's quite easy to look at and think, maybe come back to that one later, and then maybe just ignore. Whereas a much simpler email that just says, these are the 3 things you need to do right at the top, can make it much clearer what you're required to do. And then a final thing that we think about with Make It Easy is friction costs. And this is something that in the private sector, they do really well. If you think about buying something on Amazon, about how easy it is to go from looking at a product to having purchased it, Amazon have worked incredibly hard to take any friction out of that process, anything that makes it at all difficult. So it's just so easy for you to go through and buy something. So an example of this being applied in UK government policy is in the area of pensions. So a few years ago, a major pensions crisis looming. Not enough people were saving for their retirement. And we felt in conversations with government, one of the main reasons for this was that people had to opt in to having a pension. So you had to start a new job and then say, oh, yeah, I'd like to set up a pension for myself. And that's obviously quite effortful. And in that case, the default was just not having a pension. So we were arguing for this to be changed and flipped so that the default was instead that you were automatically opted into having a pension. You can still choose not to have a pension if you want to, but if you do nothing, you would then have a pension. And you can see this, so this ends up getting called auto enrollment. And you can see that it has a huge impact on the number of people saving for their retirement and having a pension, just because people like to do what's easy. And we flipped what was easy here. All right, the second part of our EASE framework is all about making it attractive, attracting people's attention. So one really effective way to do that is to use personalization. So if you think about being at a crowded party, if you hear your name across on the other side of the room, your ears will immediately prick up and you'll really pay attention to that. So we often draw on personalization, as you're going to see in a second. And then it sounds kind of obvious to say that, you know, rewards and incentives can attract people's attention, but we also think about how to design these in such a way that they draw on a kind of behavioral insights, behavioral economics theory as well. So something that we sometimes look at here is the fact that in terms of a lottery, people will overestimate their chances of winning a lottery. So a lottery can be a really effective way to incentivize behavior. So this is a project we did starting in 2020 with some schools in Bristol, looking at whether we could boost school attendance with a text message prompt. So school attendance a bit lower in Bristol than the rest of the country. So this was a focus for the local council there. And this is the intervention that we developed. So we spoke to parents, we spoke to students, we spoke to teachers. One of the things that came up was that people sometimes knew their attendance as a percentage. They knew it was like 90% attendance, but parents didn't really know what that meant. And they weren't able to say how many days of school that meant their child had missed. And this is a bit tricky because in a schools context, if you said you've got a mark of 90%, that would usually be pretty good. When it comes to attendance, 90% would actually be a number that is cause for improvement. You'd want to improve on that. So we decided to start sending out these messages to parents, letting them know how many days of school their child had missed. We tried to make it really easy to understand. So we're just spelling out they've missed 8 days of school. You can see that we've included that personalization I was talking about. So we're using the parent's name. We're making it clear which child it's about. And we also built in this thing that there's increasing evidence for, which is a bit of a fresh start effect. So we sent these out basically at the end of each half term, reflecting how many days had been missed in the previous half term. But we didn't want parents and children to feel like, oh, if I already missed some days, then I'm always going to be behind, or always going to be getting these messages. So we tried to emphasize each half term as a fresh start. So we looked at the impact of this. So this is showing the proportion of students with good attendance, which we defined as over 95%. And we've got a control group here. So this is set up in a randomized control trial. In our control group, just under 60% of students have got these good attendance records. For the parents who received our intervention, you can see that their children's attendance improves by 4 percentage points. So we got 176 more students to achieve good attendance records as a result of the intervention, which we were really pleased with. We actually had to end this trial early because the pandemic was starting to kick off and schools were closing. So this effect might have become bigger over time if we'd been able to run it for as long as we wanted to. Okay, the third part of our EASE framework is around make it social. And the first thing I'll talk about here is social norms. So this is one of the things that we're quite well known for. So one of our early bits of work was looking at encouraging how you could encourage people to pay their taxes on time. And we added just one line to the tax letter to say 9 out of 10 people in your area pay their tax on time. And we found that actually led to more people paying their taxes on time. And that's because of this concept called social norms, which is essentially the idea that we take what others are doing as a signal for what we should do as well. And we apply that quite a lot in our work. Another concept we can draw on is the idea of a network nudge. So this is the idea that if you're told to do something or encouraged to do something by either someone that you have a personal relationship with or someone you respect, then you're going to be much more likely to do it. And then the third concept we'll draw on here sometimes is commitments and reciprocity. So reciprocity is the idea that you're more likely to do something for someone else if you feel like they've done something for you first. So this is kind of a tactic I used growing up where I would tidy my room or tidy the kitchen and then tell my mum I wanted to go out somewhere. So attempting to draw there on this idea of reciprocity, and look, mum, I've done this for you. Now, can you let me go out? Which is an effective strategy. So the example I'm going to talk about here is maybe one of my favorite bits of work that we've done. We were looking at how we could encourage high attainers at underrepresented schools to apply to the very top universities. So it's still the case that you'll have students who are achieving incredibly well, who could go to the very best universities, but they're not applying. And that's maybe because not a lot of people from their school are going to those kinds of universities, maybe because they don't know about them. So it's a major challenge, still is a major challenge, which we were working on. And the solution we developed draws on this concept called the messenger effect, which is the idea that it's not just the content of a message that matters, but also who that message is coming from. So in this context, these young people, they might have heard about top universities, maybe from their teachers, maybe from their parents, but we felt that maybe a better messenger would be someone very similar to them, who'd gone to a similar school to them, and who had then gone on to one of the top universities. So we worked with this guy, Ben, the University of Bristol, real person, who kind of fit this pattern, amazing grades, and then went to a top university. And so we worked with him to write this letter, just really drawing home that if you've got those kinds of grades, you're in demand at those top universities, and you should consider applying. And what we saw when we ran the trial was that this boosted people applying to the top universities, getting an offer, and then accepting that offer. So it improved it by 34%, which is a really nice result for something that's probably one of those kind of life-changing decision moments. Okay, the final part of our EAST framework that I'm just going to talk through is all around making it timely. And this is us often thinking about what's the best moment for someone to receive an intervention for us to actually shift their behavior in the way that we want to. I'm just going to move straight to talking about the examples. This is a much more recent one. So this is some work I was doing last year as lots of schools closed. We had obviously a move to online remote learning, this kind of thing happening. And a major challenge, which some of you might be able to relate to, was how can you encourage students, learners to engage when everything's online? And so we worked with Hegarty Maths, which some of you might have heard of or even used. It's an online maths platform, which lots of schools use. So we were working with them to see if we could make any improvements to their platform. And one of the areas that we focused on was looking at what happens when a student gets a question wrong. So you're trying to expand these brackets, you get it wrong. This was the pop-up that they had come up. So it's saying, think you've typed the wrong answer, check it's sensible. And you could click OK here, but we were really interested in this little get help button, which is over here, which takes you to a video of Colin Hegarty explaining a maths concept. And this is really the heart of their platform. Ideally, they want students to watch these videos before they take on the questions. And we thought that we could change the message that appears here to increase the number of students watching these videos over here. So we tested 4 different prompts here to try and encourage students to watch the videos. And this is the second Slido question that we're going to do. So it should be coming up soon. And when it does, I'd like you to select the prompt which you think was most effective. So for prompt 1, we're drawing on social norms, which I mentioned earlier, saying that students who watch more videos get more questions right. Prompt 2, we're just trying to hammer home how useful this is, that it is a very timely piece of information. With number 3, we're trying to highlight to students it's going to benefit you in the future to watch this video. And then with 4, we were looking at drawing on that messenger effect, which I also just mentioned. So hearing from a student who might be similar to them about how useful watching these videos was. So I'm going to vote as well so I can see the results. Okay, maybe give like another 30 seconds or so for you to get the votes in. Interesting. So we've got 1 as kind of the runaway favorite, sitting on around 44%. Then 2 and 4 are kind of similar. And no one is really going for 3, which is interesting. Okay, we're going to move to showing you a few different results of what happened after we showed these different prompts. So the first one, what happened to us watching the videos, just something we wanted to encourage. So you can see the old prompt, the one they were using before, 10% of students watching the videos. With the interventions we developed, you can see they all increase it quite a lot. On this outcome, number 2 is doing the best. And if all students had got one of our prompts, over 2 million more videos would have been watched. It's a pretty nice result. But we were also interested in what happens after you watch a video. So they're then having a second attempt to that question. Are they more or less likely to get it right? Ideally, we would hope you watch the video, then you're going to be more likely to get it right. So we're hoping that our treatment arms are going to have higher accuracy than the control group. So you can see here that that is exactly what happened. So if a student was in one of the groups being shown our prompts, then the accuracy of their second attempts would improve. So this is really nice. And you can see on this one, it's actually slightly different. It's number 3 that was most effective, which was this group's least favorite of the prompts, but that was the one where students were most accurate on their second attempts. And this might start to look like quite a small difference between these two things, but the platform is so widely used that this actually means that if everyone had received one of our prompts, over 7 million more second attempts would have been correct. It's quite a big number. Now, we were also interested in what happens to students' accuracy on future first attempts. So the kind of theory we had here was, would students start to pick up on the fact that watching the videos is a good idea, start watching them before quizzes, and then become more accurate? And we can see that it looks like this is what happened. So students' accuracy on future first attempts did improve. And here, treatment 1 and treatment 3 are coming out on top, but you can see across the 3 results, it's actually all pretty similar in terms of the messages that we developed. And again, if all students had received one of these prompts, we're talking about over 750,000 more first attempts that would have been correct. Okay, the final example that I'm going to talk through is one we worked on a couple of years ago, looking at how we could encourage parents to help their children revise. So the idea here was that there's kind of, a conversation which I'm sure lots of you will have experienced, where you go home, a parent might say, what homework do you have this weekend? You might give an eloquent response, like the one you can see here, kind of not really giving them much information at all. So we wanted to change this a little bit. So we started sending out these timely prompts to parents, ideally to equip them with a bit more information. So we sent out things like this. So Raj has got a maths test on Friday. Please remind him to study and help in any other way that you can. And the idea behind this was to give parents a bit of information before the test happens, when basically what you can do on how you perform on the test could still change. And this meant, kind of in terms of our theories as to how this could work, that parents would be able to say, oh, you've got a maths test on Friday. What do we need to do to get you prepared? Which kind of sets up quite a different conversation. So in terms of the results of doing this, it improved maths test scores by the equivalent of 1 month of teaching, just by sending a couple of messages. Didn't cost very much to do. We spoke to parents and pupils afterwards. Parents were pretty keen on it. That was good. In terms of pupils, the response was generally, that was pretty annoying, that you were messaging my parents, meant that you were on my back, they were on my back a little bit, they knew about the test, so they were, asking me to prepare for it. But there was a sense from the pupils that, but actually that was kind of helpful. And when we asked both pupils who'd received the messages and pupils who hadn't received the messages, would you like this to continue? It was the pupils who had actually received the messages that were more likely to say they wanted it to continue. So that's a very kind of quick tour, a little taste of the kind of work that we do. If it's kind of caught your attention, you want to know more about behavioural insights, we've got some kind of freely available online resources. So we've written one which is focused on the school space, which, as I've said, is what I focus on. We also have this publication East. This may be the one I'd recommend you go to, looking at 4 simple ways to apply behavioural insights. Got lots more examples in it that you can read through. If you're more interested in the kind of randomized control trial side of things and how we evaluate our ideas, then search for this Test, Learn, Adapt document. That is everything that I'm going to go through. So I think we've now got some time for questions, which I'm very happy to take. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. We'll move on to the Q&A now. Just to anyone who's got questions, put them in the chat or the Q&A, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can. First question from Mr. Gardner. Have there been any behavioural interventions the BIT have introduced that have actually had the opposite effects compared to what was intended? And if so, why?
Yeah, so that has happened. There will be times when we'll come up with an idea, test it, and it won't work. And those times you kind of, okay. Sometimes, yeah, you will also see what we call a backfire effect. So maybe we wanted to encourage kids to go to school and we lowered attendance. We think it's actually, that's why we put such an emphasis on testing the ideas. So, we know the theory, we've done lots of this kind of work before, but whenever you're in a new context, a new challenge, don't know exactly what's going to happen. So that's why we think it's so important to evaluate these ideas. And yeah, sometimes you'll get it wrong, and you might see a backfire effect.
Now we have another question from another attendee, and they're asking, do behavioural biases affect prices in the financial markets?
Do behavioural biases affect prices in financial markets?
Yeah.
Not really my area. I'd say probably yes. And there's a kind of a whole literature on behavioural finance, which you can look into, but not really something I'm an expert in. But I'd probably argue yes.
Okay, thanks. Another question from an anonymous attendee. Do you ever consider the ethics of behavioural economics?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a really important part of our work, particularly the kind of work that I do in a school's context. And you will sometimes get some kind of ethical objections to the idea of a randomized control trial. So giving some people one thing and not giving it to other people. I'd actually argue if you're testing out a new idea, as we were kind of just talking about, if you're not sure whether it's going to work or not, it's more ethical to do it in a randomized controlled trial than just giving something to everybody when you're not sure whether it works or not. And our kind of work, we're not ever taking things away from people. We're kind of testing out a new idea. Does it work or not? And we go through ethical review also for all of our work, particularly if it involves children or any kind of vulnerable groups, to make sure that it is ethical and that we're making the case as to why it is ethical.
We have another question from an attendee called George, and they're asking, do you think that rationality means economic theories are inaccurate?
Depends, yeah, depends which economic theories you're talking about. I think one of my favorite old economics professors would say this quote, which someone else I think said or is thought to have said, which states all models are wrong, but some are useful. So I think, lots of the old economic theory models that, they're likely to be wrong in some way, right? They often rest on assumptions. We often joke about economists, always making all of these assumptions about something, but those models are also useful, right, in certain circumstances. But it's pretty tough sell to claim that you've created a model or a theory which applies in all circumstances all of the time.
Okay, thanks. Another question is, with your trials in the schools, have you found any significant difference between behavioural changes between girls and boys?
That's an interesting question. I mean, we haven't seen that in any of our trials so far. We have done, and we are doing some work at the moment, which is looking at trying to improve girls' sense of belonging in computing. So that's one of the focus areas of our work at the moment. And for that, I think it's going to be interesting because we've developed the intervention, obviously with that outcome in mind, but the intervention will be received by both boys and girls. So we're going to see, does it have more of an impact for girls, or does it might just improve things for both groups, which would be good. So yeah, nothing kind of historic, but we might have more work on that coming up soon.
Personal question, which is about same-sex schools and grades and deviations. There was an article in the Behavioural Insights team that mentioned that references kind of increased the gender pay gap because people referred to people that were similar to them. Do same-sex schools help students get higher wages later in life? Is there a correlation between that?
So yeah, the evidence around same-sex schools kind of contest it. I think there isn't a clear answer to that question, because that's not the only difference between that kind of school and another school. So it's hard to isolate the fact that it's like just girls or just boys from, there are probably some other unique things about that school going on. So I'm not super familiar with that academic literature, but my sense of it is that it's pretty hard to answer that question in a really authoritative and conclusive way.
Okay, so the next question from Stefan's group is, do you think that consenting being the default choice for cookies online is problematic?
Consenting as the default? Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think GDPR, so it's kind of the data laws which come into play recently, is very positive for lots of reasons. It also has increased the burden on researchers like me in running the kind of projects that we want to do. So we have to go through a whole load of stuff to run all of our projects and make sure that everything is GDPR compliant. I think with something like cookies and the default being yes, but you have the option to say no, that probably is where I would land on that particular issue, but it's probably a personal kind of view on what you think is right there. Kind of from a behavioral insights point of view, I think people should always have the choice, and you should always be giving people the choice to either do X thing or do Y thing. And then, yeah, it's kind of, there is more of a personal viewpoint as to what you think the default should be.
We have a question from Josie asking, has the Behavioural Insights team been active in helping to shape the COVID-19 messaging for the government?
So yeah, we've done some work with the government in terms of the COVID response. Obviously, lots of the issues around COVID are behavioural. So you're particularly in the early stages of the pandemic, we were working on things like what's the most effective poster to encourage people to wash their hands, for example, and that was kind of a heavy focus early on. So we've worked on small bits and pieces like that along the way. We've done various bits of research as well, which we've
can I follow that up?
Yeah,
Josie,
sure.
Josie's followed up with saying, for example, I've noticed nearly all the adverts encouraging us to use lateral flow tests feature young women. She says, why?
So I don't know. And I was just going to come on to and say, we've done some research, we've given some advice, but it's kind of like it's kind of similar to the other scientists, right? Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance, like we might give our advice and they might come to a different conclusion sometimes. So, we're not able to influence, or, we haven't been driving everything that they've been doing. And so unfortunately, I don't know about the young women on the lateral flow tests and why that is.
Okay, so another question from Max. Other than gender, are there any other socioeconomic groups for which behavioural interventions are more or less effective?
So depends on the intervention and the context. Generally, for the work I've done, we haven't seen any kind of major differences by those kind of characteristics. One thing that we will look at in almost every education project, if we can, is if there's a different impact for free school meal pupils. So that's something which we look at. We try and make sure that the intervention is also working for that group, as well as kind of the overall group too. But I don't think we've had something where the difference is kind of incredibly stark in terms of the outcome across the groups, but it could happen. It's theoretically possible.
It's a great question, and unfortunately they haven't attached their names, so I can't give them credit. But the question is, with poor exam results possibly caused by boys watching too many football matches, are there equivalent incidences affecting girls in exam results?
Affecting girls in exam results? Yeah, I've been doing presentations like this for about 5 years, always with the boys and the football. I don't think I've ever found something which, or researchers have never kind of done a study into a similar impact for girls. So no, not that I'm aware of. Interested if anyone has a theory around something that could have that kind of impact.
Now, another question from Mr. Flowers' group is, how do you decide when intervention is required?
Yeah, that's a good question. So a lot of our projects are either funded by government or funded by a foundation or a charity of some kind. So it's partly a response to whatever the political priority is, or an area of interest. But it usually involves us looking at, let's say it's something like attendance, and so this project in Bristol that we did is a good example. We had a partnership with Bristol City Council, working with them across a range of challenges. And one of the things that we saw when looking at their data was that attendance in Bristol is lower than in the rest of the country. And then we did that very specific project in response to that challenge. But it's usually when there's some kind of outcome or metric which is lower than we would like it to be. And that's usually when we'll work to try and improve it.
Another great question. Again, unfortunately, they haven't said who's given this, but how do you determine what causes the change that you find in your randomized control trials? Or do you care more about the result, less about why it happened?
That's a really nice question. Yeah, that person should get credit. So the kind of beauty of the randomized control trial method is that in terms of looking at the impact on the outcome, we've so for the trial in Bristol, we take all the parents, we randomly allocate them to either receiving the messages or not receiving the messages. In all other ways, we can assume they're pretty similar, and the number is big enough that we can assume that these two groups are similar. So then when we look at the outcomes, we can attribute that to our intervention. Now, the second part of the question was really interesting. They're talking about, do you care about why something has worked or not worked, as well as did it work or not work? The answer is yes, we do care. So for most of our projects, and in kind of all of our ideal projects, we would do something as well as the kind of impact evaluation, which is like the did it work part. We'll do what's called an implementation and process evaluation. So that's looking at how was the intervention implemented and what did people think and feel about the intervention if they received it. So we also get that kind of qualitative feedback, and people saying so kind of like I mentioned with the parents and the text messages, talking to parents, they really like it. Talking to kids, they thought it was annoying but maybe useful. So yeah, we do look at that stuff, and it is really important.
Okay, thanks. So another question from Sam and Will. What is your favorite nudge of all time?
Oh, my favorite nudge of all time. What a question. Think about in terms of my work we've done. I'm really proud of that university letters trial. I think when I was getting into this as an area, when I was doing my A-levels and reading a book like Nudge, I think that the idea that first kind of hooked me in was Richard Thaler talks about they kind of sticking an image of a fly on a men's urinal, and that being an effective strategy to make that a cleaner environment as gentlemen aim for the fly. So yeah, I've always found that quite entertaining. And in some football stadiums now, they have the ones where it's like a goal in the urinal. And that, yeah, I've always found that a nice, simple, some interventions are very complicated. That is just a nice, simple nudge.
How much does grade deviation affect final pay? Because you mentioned that students are attaining different grades and this have longer term effects. How big are those effects often? Especially with grade inflation, since the boundaries between grades are being very blurred.
Yes, I mean, the answer to that question all depends on what different grades you're talking about, right? You can get quite significant differences between whether you've achieved what's set as kind of the minimum threshold outcome in English and maths, whether you've got that or not can have a really significant impact. When you're talking about stuff like the difference between an A star and an A, the difference on your lifetime earnings is probably much smaller. But yeah, I don't have all the figures at the top of my head, but there's a big empirical academic literature around that.
So another question on ethics. Apart from the control groups and research groups that you mentioned earlier, have you thought about the ethics of your research as in manipulating people in any way?
Yeah, so we do. And the response I'd usually give to that is kind of, there's often no such thing as a completely neutral environment in which someone is behaving. Whatever setup is currently in place has some kind of manipulation around it. And so the example I'll often think about here is like a school canteen and the order of food in a school canteen. There has to be some kind of order of food in the school canteen, right? You can't have everything in the same place. And so we might come along and do something like, oh, you've got the chips first. We'd like to put the fruit first and the chips later. And that is changing the kind of choice environment, but we're not taking the chips away. They're still there. And that change is just like the existing setup is in itself a kind of manipulation, right? It's just maybe the first version was encouraging people to have more chips. Our version might encourage people to have more fruit. So that's kind of how we think about it.
We have a simple yet broader question, which is, are humans more egoistic or altruistic?
That's an interesting question. I don't know. Depends a bit on how you define those two things, right? Egotistic, altruistic. I'm sure some people have done research on that. I think it's probably also like slightly a philosophical question. Interesting. But yeah, don't have too much to say on it.
So what would your advice be for students watching this who might be considering a career involving behavioural economics or insights?
Yeah, my advice would be we kind of take people from quite a broad range of academic backgrounds. So I wouldn't say that it's like you have to study X degree. I studied economics and then I did a master's in economics and public policy. We also have people come in with more of a psychology background. So behavioral economics is kind of the fusing of economics and psychology. So we take people from both back. We also take, some people who studied anthropology. Some people studied, different subjects entirely, and then they come in and kind of learn and upskill themselves, and then do this kind of work too. So there isn't one set background of person that does this kind of work. So yeah, I think go to university, do one of those kind of degrees, read broadly around the subject, and then yeah, if it's something that interests you, make an application to the team. It would be great to see someone from this talk coming along in a few years' time.
Now another question on, it's about the course you do rather than the university. Again, in terms of income deviation, I know you may not have the stats on you, but what do you think plays a bigger role in the sort of income you get? The university you went to or the course you did?
Yeah, interesting question. I'm not going to be able to give a particularly satisfying answer because it depends on both. Obviously, certain employers will look at certain universities and be like, this is a good university to have gone to. But then employers will also do that with the subject, right? So it's a bit of a balance. I would probably say, but this is more of just like a personal comment than this is going to earn you more money in the future. But I would say that enjoying the course is probably more important than just going to a certain university, right? You've got to study the course for 3 years and ideally get a good grade in it. So personally, I would prioritize that, but not official advice.
Another question from Jonty and Josh. Are there any behavioural interventions that work particularly well at managing the behaviour of football fans?
Oh, the behaviour of football fans. I don't think, that would be a fascinating area for us to work on. I don't think we've done really anything on it before. I was actually at Wembley last night for the Italy-Spain game. And yeah, that was kind of interesting. It was the first time Wembley had gone to 75%. And I think they were maybe struggling a little bit with, the COVID rules and also trying to get football fans to behave in certain ways. So yeah, no, the only thing I can think is the work around urinals, which I mentioned a few questions ago. But you know, like England fans were singing "It's Coming Home," and you know, the Spain and the Italian fans weren't too pleased about that. Is there a way you could encourage people to not do that? I don't know. Maybe not.
There's an attendee who's asking that young people from lower income areas often only see the options as sport, music, or secondary economies. How could behavioral economics be used to change this? And is this something that the BIT team is already looking at?
So we're talking kind of about the aspirations of people from certain schools. Yes, I think the university Letters trial was us looking at this issue, right? And I think one of the solutions which we looked at there, and which we would probably recommend, is trying to, if that is the case, that people at that school feel like they're a more limited set of options, trying to expose them to people like them who've actually gone and done, you know, this completely different thing and this other completely different thing over here, just so that they have all of the information of the things they could do. And I think that's what we were really focused on with that intervention, was just highlighting to those pupils, because we looked at their GCSE results, and so only students with really good GCSEs got that letter saying, you know, if you're achieving like this, you can basically do anything in terms of your next step. And yeah, I think making that information available to those people is really important.
So another question from an anonymous person, but which part of the EAST concept have you found is most valuable when considering policies?
A nice question. I think it is easy, which we have in a different color, kind of, as I mentioned, because it's just like, I know myself in terms of how I am. People are lazy, and like, if you can make something easy, that can often like really make the difference. And it's, yeah, so I think with almost every kind of intervention that I'm working on, I'm always thinking like, is there also a way to like make this easy? Because I think, yeah, it really can have quite a significant impact.
In behavioral economics, you kind of go against the rational agent paradigm. So again, slightly philosophical question, but is it more of a science or an art, behavioral economics? I
think behavioral economics, I mean, you're right, it is a philosophical question. It has elements of both. But I think the fact that we so often use randomized control trials as like the test of do our ideas work or not, that would probably lead me to say it's like, it definitely has strong elements of a scientific method. Like, that is a very scientific method. But you know, there is also an art element in the thinking about people's behavior, and also in the creativity of like thinking of a message that you think is going to change it some kind of way.
I've got a question, is how would you yourself define rationality? Do you think behavioral economics has changed how we think about it?
Yeah, I think behavioral economics probably has changed how we think about rationality. Different people would define it in different ways. But yeah, I mean, I can, looking back to both when I studied and when I taught the A-level economics course, you kind of have all this rationality that like underpins like 90% of the course. And now we're starting to say, oh, and here's like behavioral economics. But if you start to get switched on to behavioral economics, and you then look at all of the other stuff, then you might start to think like, oh, well, like, how can this be like the model that we're going with if we think that this is true over here? So yeah, tricky. People probably define it in different ways. I think behavioral economics has clearly had a major impact on economics as like a broader academic discipline, and that's probably most demonstrated by, you know, when people were first setting out these kinds of theories and this kind of work, they were like the, upstarts, not invited to conferences, like alienated from the rest of the profession. And now those individuals have won Nobel Prizes in economics and are like much more mainstream figures. So I think that demonstrates like a lot of the change.
Okay, we've got to wrap up now because we're running out of time. Thank you so much for the talk. That was very interesting and some great questions from students as well. We've got to remind everyone that the workshop begins at 11:45, and other than that, I think we're done. Thank you very much again.
Awesome. Thanks everyone for listening. See ya.